On a gathering storm comes a tall, handsome man in a dusty black coat with a red right hand. This week on Detecting the Marvelous, we talk Hellboy Volume 1. So this is a special episode. I have an amazing special guest today. Welcome to Detecting the Marvelous. I am joined by my brother, Nick. So, Nick,
Hello.
welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I've never done a podcast before, so this should be interesting.
Yeah, first time for everything. Once you start, it's hard to stop. I mean, I've got a minor podcast addiction at this point. Like I'm on 5. So yeah, it's a it's the crack cocaine of midlife crises. But yeah.
Better than buying a motorcycle.
Yes, yeah. Only slightly less dangerous. Uh, yeah. Before we start getting into health, you love comics. I know this. What were some of your earliest comics that you started reading, and entered the comic world with?
Oh wow. Yeah, I used to sneak into your room and steal your comics. It was old issues of the New Mutants. That number X-Men #1 with Jim Lee and Chris Claremont back in the day.
Mhm.
The first comic book I think I remember owning for myself was a Thundercats comic from Star. That shows how old I am now.
Oh.
But yeah, I've always been like more of a Marvel guy. Um, so yeah, that's really where I
Mhm.
started out. Spider-Man was always my jam. X-Men, uh, DC here and there, but yeah, it's always just mostly Marvel.
Awesome. Do you have so is Spider-Man your favorite comic book, you'd say, or do you have another that's your favorite?
I don't read a lot of as hipster as this sounds. I don't read a lot of mainstream stuff now anymore. Um, Spider Spider-Man will always be my favorite superhero, but the stuff that they've been putting out the past couple of years just hasn't appealed to me as much. I like I
Mhm.
said, I'll always love Marvel and I'll always love the characters, but just I'm finding a lot of the interesting stuff in the less mainstream. God, that makes me sound so pretentious, but yeah, like that's how kind of how I fell into Hellboy in the first place was a lot of the stories in comic books in like the mainstream stuff like the DC and the Marvel stuff just felt played it's the same stuff over and over and over again with
Yeah.
micro reboots, new #1s all the time. So I just kind of got tired of that and I wanted to see something or try something different. That's why a lot of this stuff like Image, I really dig a lot of stuff over at Image. Um, Dark Horse puts out a ton of great stuff. So just more the indie stuff nowadays, or if you can even call those publishers indie compared to like some of the free press stuff that you get online. But
Cool. Yeah. I mean, I had a similar experience. For me, it was Age of Apocalypse that did me in, and then I sort of found Sandman, and that
mhm.
sort of brought me into the world of sort of alternative comics. But it's funny, you snuck in and took my comics, and Tash, our sister, snuck in and took my CDs. So it turns out I was cooler than I thought. You
which
heard it
is funny because
here.
I which is funny because I would steal Tasha's CDs, which turns out that I'm just stealing your stuff after all.
Yeah, it's recycling. It's all just
Yeah.
recycling. There we go. Yeah, so I mean, you answered my next question. How do you find Hellboy? When did you find Hellboy? Like, when did like was there a point that you were just like, I'm done with the Spider Mans and the X Men's and stuff, or was
Um,
it just
I
gradual?
It was more like a gradual thing, honestly. like I started reading Hellboy right around Conqueror Worm, which was like 97, 98. Um, could be a little off there on my numbers, but yeah, it was around that point. And then Hellboy stuck consistently for me. Like it was always there's Hellboy stories and there's like BPRD Mike Mignola stories of varying quality, but they're never bad. Whereas like if you read a bad Spider-Man or if you read a bad X-Men issue, it's bad. Like there are some things that get published by the big two that are just cringy as hell. Um, like I mean, there was the DC KFC crossover uh, supplemental thing that was came out a few years back, but it just I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of it, yeah, it's just if a lot of it came to, I got tired of the same old stuff in the mainstream stuff, and then Hellboy was just always good. A big part of it also comes from it's one. There's a lot of hands that go into making the Hellboy. Hellboy is a part of a larger shared universe called the Mignolaverse, uh, after Mike Mignola, the creator.
Mm-hmm.
But he has his hand in every single story. While he doesn't necessarily script it, he comes up with the story ideas. He does the preliminary character design work with the artist on the book. So regardless of who's drawing it, it feels like a Mike Mignola illustration, or design at least. Excuse me. So there's a consistent
It's
voice.
like, yeah, I was gonna say, like, this compared to like X-Men or what, Spider-Man or any of the DC comics, it's his vision. Whereas
Yeah,
like you look at like that the latest Age of Krakoa stuff, which straight up turned me off the X-Men entirely. It started as an interesting concept and then got so weird. I was just like, no, they've just messed with these characters that I love too much. I mean, like, if you like it, more power to you, but just not for me. But at least with
yeah. I
Hellboy and
mean,
the Magnolia universe stuff, it's all the same heart in it, right?
yeah, yeah. Like, you know going into a Hellboy book, like there's gonna be twists and turns, but you know you're getting a Hellboy book or BPRD or Witchfinder, any of the spin-offs of the books. Like especially with the Hellboy stories, it's like so many of them could just be cookie cutter almost because it's just like Hellboy travels somewhere to investigate something. There's a weird monster. He fights it. Punchline at the end. Like that could be it, but they're never boring. That's the funny thing. Like
Yeah,
I've read every single thing in the Mignolaverse multiple times, and it's never dull, and that's what I like about it. It's just always a fun kind of romp.
yeah.
I mean, there are some like I said, some better than others, but they're never bad.
Yeah. One of the things I find interesting about it too is it kind of like, I mean, he draws a lot of inspiration from Lovecraftian stories, and the way that he does it when he collaborates is a lot like, Lovecraft without the being a horrible racist monster. Um,
Yeah,
it's like he talks it out. He works with his collaborators because like Conan the Conan stories were in the same were in a Lovecraftian universe. They're the ancient history of the Lovecraft universe. Like all those early Lovecraft writers were buddies of or Lovecraftian writers, like Howard and stuff were these friends of H.P. Lovecraft, and they talked it out, and you get the same kind of creative process here, and it shows because you have that vision, you have that consistent tone, even if there's minor differences from project to project, it still feels the same. I find the turtles are the same in a lot of of their projects because like Laird and Eastman remain consistently involved as well, even if they aren't completely hands on. They have um, at least their attention is on it.
yeah. With the comic books, especially, like I think Laird took a buyout and like years back, and he doesn't really do much with it. But Kevin Eastman
Mhm.
is still, at least with the IDW stuff. I believe he's still considered publisher, or at least story editor or something along those lines, because
Yeah.
he still works very much with Sophie Campbell. She just finished up her run, which was a really good run. And then, forgive me, I'm forgetting the writer's first name, but Waltz was the guy who started this most recent Ninja Turtles run, and it's him, Kevin Eastman, and then it was Sophie Campbell and Kevin Eastman, and I think now going to the Jason Aaron run, it'll still be Kevin Eastman participating. So I think, I think that's part of why, independent creator owned stuff tends to appeal to me more, just because there is the consistent voice of people who are wanting to do it. Not that I'm saying mainstream comic book writers don't want to do their job, because I mean, who wouldn't want to write Superman? Like, that's like any
Yeah.
comic book fan's dream. But you don't know what you're going to do is not going to be undone 6 weeks after you're done your run. Like, some new writer comes in and completely just wipes the clears the table, like the Krakoan age of X-Men. Like, you look at what's coming out with the new creators on the book post Fall of X, and it's all like
Yeah.
the mansion is back in some capacity. They're all mutants are back in the regular world, and Krakoa is done, which is like there's always a status quo to return to. It's like, oh, I equate it to like Deep Space Nine and Voyager. Deep Space Nine was a long form story that like told something, and there was consequences in each episode. Voyager, everything returned to the status quo at the end of the episode, whether that was like the year of hell or the weird lizard babies. They're just never mentioned again. So like
Yeah.
Hellboy has consequences. Like going into the Seed of Destruction, the first volume, it sets up everything unknowingly. Like, you don't know going into it that this is all going to be big parts of other things. So it's like, and that's appealing. That's really
Literally,
appealing.
this the seed of the story has
Yeah,
been
exactly,
planted.
exactly. Yeah.
Well, yeah, yeah. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to give a little bit of history here about Hellboy and Mike Mignola, and then we'll talk about the plot of Seeds of Destruction.
Cool.
Okay, so created by California-born comic creator Mike Mignola, whose list of awards is honestly too long to go into, but it's everything from an Eisner and an Eagles to a Harvey's and an Inkpot. Um, his earliest work was illustrating the comic Reader before scoring a job on Red Sonja. He is a Cal Arts grad with a BFA in illustration, which I feel kind of shows in his distinct visual style. It's very graphically sort of pushed. Um, in one interview, he mentioned, "I am thinking about color all the time, sometimes as far back as the plotting sequence." One of his most famous works being the cover of Batman's A Death in the Family. He felt that was just a contract job, and he's always sort of taken aback when people ask him questions about it because he's just like, well, I don't know. It's just something I did. Um, his more interesting work in the DC world is like Gotham by Gaslight, where he drew from sources as diverse as Tim Burton's Batman to The Man Who Laughs, whose Gwynplaine was the inspiration for the original Joker. But we're here to talk about Hellboy, the best paranormal investigator of all time, the big red boy from the BRP or BPRD. Appearing in a couple of Comic Con one shots in 1993, he debuted formally in 1994, uh, issued by published by Dark Horse in the March to June release. So this is makes him a 30 years old right now. Seeds of Destruction's run is right in the middle of its 30-year anniversary of its release. His striking design went through several incarnations and refinements before we landed on the design we have today. He started as a 1991 drawing for the Great Salt Lake Comic Con before developing into a team. But Mike found Hellboy was just too darned interesting, and he couldn't think of any cool names to go with the rest of the members, so he just made it a solo comic. Originally conceived as a shared universe with John Byrne and John Byrne, who helped script some of the stories. Art Adams' work was also supposed to be a part of the universe, all under Dark Horse's Legends imprint, hence the presence of Torch of Liberty and Seeds of Destruction. This was quickly jettisoned when they all realized the logistical nightmares, but also the creative restrictions that would cause. They quickly spun off into their own universes, with future crossovers being written out or omitted in reprints where possible. In an interview, Mike said, "When I started the Hellboy series way back when, I wasn't really thinking consciously about the humor, but Hellboy does have a lot of my personality, and that's an important part of my personality." So yeah, so that's a bit of a history there. I mean, Mike's a really interesting creator in that he's very graphic design oriented. I find that like that Cal Arts vibe really runs through, but in a good way. I mean, I'm not anti. There's a lot of people who are like, "Oh, Cal Art style." Blah. I'm not one of them. I find his attention to sort of illustration and the graphical imprint on the page is kind of revolutionary.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I as a wannabe comic book artist myself, I aspire to Mignola. Like to ape him, to ape his art style is next to near impossible because just the amount of thought in the most basic things that he does uh, is almost impossible to copy. And yeah, he is so. We'll get into his art a little later when we talk about more about the first issues of Hellboy, but like he is unparalleled in what he does.
Mhm. It's kind of neat because that was in those the early '90s. There, it really did feel like the Mystery Limited Run or the Max, that there were a lot of people pushing art styles in different directions that weren't common up until that point, that they were sort of outside of that, but all in the service of the narrative, which is so seldom done. So yeah, so let's talk about the plot. So we have evil Nazis. I mean, that's always a good sign when they're evil. Uh, but yeah, they're trying to run some ritual, and in Scotland, they summon a demon baby, but due to ghostly interference, he actually appears elsewhere and is adopted by a professor and raised to be a paranormal investigator. Um, so so like so this first is a very it's a interesting start because they set up Rasputin at the very beginning. They set up um, these Nazi villains, um, and they kind of lay the groundwork for the mythos, but they don't really like. It's a four issue sort of arc, but they leave a lot of mystery there, which is really cool.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. He didn't. Seed of Destruction starts in like an interesting way because those familiar with the Guillermo del Toro version, or even to a lesser extent the most recent Hellboy, where it's just like Hellboy appears amidst the Nazis, and then the American soldiers fight um, fight the Nazis to get Hellboy. Essentially, that doesn't happen in the comic. It's almost confusing to the point where it's just like, oh wait, they're not in the same place. What happened to all these bad guys? So it's like there's like a Nazi with like a swastika monocle that Mike Mignola said he just liked it because it looked funny or cool.
Yeah.
I don't think that character ever appears again in the Hellboy comics, but
No,
he just
yeah.
has like
In the trade I was reading, it talks about how he's committed to an asylum and then just died, having been eaten from the inside out by beetles.
yeah.
It's just like,
Those kinds of
okay, I guess we're
asides,
not seeing him again.
yeah. Those kinds of asides happen a lot in Hellboy books and BPRD books, which are always fantastic.
Mm.
But yeah, like it's the opening of the series kind of bucks the traditional uh, action sequence that you would expect from a comic book or an action movie or something like that, where it's just like, oh no, he appeared hundreds of miles away, and then it just jumps 50 years into the future, and Hellboy is all grown up. Um,
Yeah.
and like Professor Brutenholm, or most like as Mignola says, it's supposed to be pronounced Broom. Um, he's kind of a not an afterthought in this opening of the story, but he's introduced, and then he shows up once it catches up to like the early 90s or mid 90s when the book was initially supposed to take place, and then he just he dies.
Mm.
Like he's and it's just like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, and they just kind of gloss over their whole history. Um, but he comes back in a big way again, like talking about earlier. Like it's it's seeding a bunch of stories really early on, which was really really cool.
I think the one thing about the films, especially like I don't really, I mean, as much as I like the guy from Stranger Things, and I thought, oh, it's actually pretty decent casting for a new Hellboy. Like the movie is just such a hot mess. I'm just like, not worth it. But the Del Toro adaptation is about, I think, as because it involved the comic creators in the creation of the story. I mean, there's certain liberties that have to be taken for the medium, and they have a 2 hour window ish this is like before the 3.5 hour cinematic snooze fests that we get today. But we had to condense a lot of stuff, but also establish stakes much more early. So I think that's why we get the much more in-depth relationship with Professor Broom, and we get the setting up of Liz as a new member and everything, as opposed to being an established member. It's to introduce people a little bit more readily.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of action for like the first two issues. It's not until like issue three that we really, well, I mean, not entirely true. Sorry. Issue two, we get the introduction of the brothers, who or issue one, we get one small action sequence with the Frogman.
Yeah, when it starts
And
raining
then
frogs
they
and yeah.
Yeah, and then it comes back again towards the end of issue two. But it's like, in the film you have this big subway scene out of the gate kind of thing, whereas with this
Mhm.
it's like, yeah, it's not until really towards the end of the four issues that you get a lot of the superhero shenanigans that you would expect from a lot of comic books.
There's almost like a noir vibe with Seed of Destruction, which I think comes from John Byrne doing the dialogue for the first
Hmm.
series. It's a very different vibe from the rest of the series because there's a first person narrative that doesn't exist or appear really anywhere else within the Hellboy stories. Like you get Hellboy's internal dialogue uh, in Seed of Destruction, which it doesn't really happen again. It's he's very much like, "Aw, crap," and that's the most inner dialogue you get from him from then on out. But like I, and it almost feels
Hmm.
like what Frank Miller was trying to do with Sin City, where it was just be like these large dialogue boxes of
Hmm.
just rambling, um, and that doesn't feel quite the same in tone. But yeah, it's got a very almost noir vibe to it. Now I think
Yeah.
for the first series, it was almost necessary to help establish everything, to kind of set up the world. But that
Yeah.
again, that
Yeah.
once Byrne leaves, that disappears. That kind of
Yeah.
narrative form almost.
And one of the things is like, even though this is like very dense exposition and using that sort of noir technique, it's not overwhelming. Like I we during the first season of the podcast, we did X-Men #1, which is, Claremont's sort of reboot with blue and gold team. And it that was so just walls and walls and walls of text. It was like there was so much text at points it interfered with the artwork, and it
Yeah,
never feels like that. I mean, I think because there's a lot of this that doesn't use the standard comic paneling format. Like, you'll have a banner image of Hellboy crouching, and then like a quarter page panel, and then two like eighth of a page panels on a page. So he just plays with the page in a way that gives you room to have this dialogue and have this exposition, but not feel overwhelmed.
yeah, and like that goes back to like his art style. Like, there's a big thing with artists in comics where it's like you don't want to waste space because you only have so much room to tell a. I guess nowadays it's like 22-page story. um, Mignola kind of revels in the empty space. Like, he is all about negative space, um, and nowhere more so than here. Like, there's just a comic. There's just a panel where it starts to rain frogs, and it's just negative silhouettes of frogs for one panel, and then just a single frog for the next panel, and that's not usually done in a comic book. And that comes, like you're saying, with Claremont. He is so wordy, uh, that yeah, it's almost a fight for space between whoever's illustrating and whoever's writing it. Like Claremont and Jim Lee, they're just like, Jim Lee's so big and bombastic, and then Claremont is so verbose that it's just like it's overwhelming at times. This doesn't have that.
And and what I found so effective too is, at least for these four issues, is they really establish a relationship with the character right away. Like, you actually, like, Liz is not in it very much um in the lead up, but you have that relationship. It's clear that there's something between her and Hellboy. It's clear that Abe and Hellboy are friends and buddies, and it doesn't take long to get to that place, but it doesn't feel rushed at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, everything, like, yeah, for a 4-issue story, it feels very dense without being a slog. And that's,
Hmm.
well, hell, I think there are some writers who will try to take 12 issues to tell the same kind of story, and it's like super decompressed storytelling, and it's just like, um Mignola has an interesting balance because he can tell what would feel like a big story in very small space, but he can still do a splash page here and there, and it's just like it doesn't feel like wasted space.
Yeah. It's very cinematic in a lot of ways, I find. Like,
Mhm.
it's not like storyboarding, but you can imagine this happening in your head so easily, as if it was something that was just on the screen, even though it's not. Um, well, since we brought it up, the films, how did you feel about the adaptation?
Um, so for the Guillermo del Toro ones, when I first watched them, I absolutely loved them. The first one feels like the right kind of balance between Mignola and Guillermo del Toro, where the second one is almost pure Guillermo, like Golden Army is almost pure
Hmm.
Guillermo del Toro. with like the clockwork gears
Mm.
and the fairies and all that kind of stuff. Um, the less said about
Yeah.
the most recent one, probably the better. Uh, but there is a magic to that first Hellboy movie. It feels it was done relatively inexpensively. It was like shot in Prague, which was like the perfect kind of place. There was a lot of love into that one. Um, you could tell Mike Mignola was having a blast. You could tell
Hmm.
Guillermo del Toro was having a blast. Um, whereas the most recent, Alan Taylor, I want to say, as the director. Um,
Yeah, I think so.
he- yeah, there was so much studio interference um, that he kind of like just Alan Taylor's heart wasn't into it. David Harbour is trying his best to carry the film. They had some great people, but what's his face as Professor Broom was not a great casting. Oh crap, what's his name? Ian McShane was not a great Professor Broom. Whereas like
Yeah.
William Hurt was William Hurt. I always get the two Hurt
Yeah.
actors mixed up. Yeah, he was the
Yes.
perfect
The one that
Professor
was in
Broom. Like,
Doctor Who.
yes, yeah, the War Doctor. Yeah, he was the perfect
Yeah.
Professor Broom. Um,
Yeah.
he captured that kind of like
Yeah. He just had that world weary element, right? Like
yeah,
just
he's
like
he's he's still very British. He's still very um, proper, but he's seen some shit. Like he's faced demons.
yeah.
He's stared at the void directly, and he's still like, I'm gonna have a spot of tea before bed. But whereas like Ian McShane's just like, I'm grumpy all the time, and that's not Broom. That's not Broom. I will say though
No.
the Wild Hunt arc that they included in the most recent one, I really liked, along with the Baba Yaga. Um, See, I think my biggest problem with the most recent Hellboy movie, it felt like a lot of discordant parts. Like they were trying to adapt one too many things, um, and they just didn't fit. Like they were attacking, excuse me, adapting the Wild Hunt, Storm and Fury, the Baba Yaga storyline, and then there's just like hardcore horror stuff mixed in, and then even bits of Seed of Destruction is mixed in there too. And it's just like you either have to
It
ease
feels
people.
very much. s- Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, yeah, you have to ease people into. You either have to ease people into Hellboy's universe, like Guillermo del Toro did, or with the one that's coming out soon, then there's a new adaptation of. Um, oh God, I'm blanking on the name of the story. Um, the Smiling Man. Oh God, I am. This is terrible. But there's a new adaptation that's like a direct adaptation of a
Let's see
single
here for you.
Hellboy. Sorry.
The Crooked Man.
The Crooked Man, thank you. Yes, I was thinking the Smiling Man, but I knew that wasn't right. The Crooked Man story, which is like a one and done story, and they're pretty much just ignoring everything else. Like it's almost like you're just expected to know that Hellboy exists, and people are
Hmm.
totally okay with seeing a 6'6" giant red ape of a man with a stone hand, and that's how the comics are in general. Like people will talk to Hellboy and not react. Whereas like in real life, it'd be like, holy crap, there's a giant demon talking to me. But he's just one of the guys. And I think, like I said, it's like you either go the one ease people in or you just accept it. You don't go just balls to the wall like Alan Taylor did
Hmm.
in his adaptation. So I think
Yeah.
that's probably my gripe about the most recent one.
Yeah. I mean, it feels very much like when Sony starts interfering with the Spider-Man movie. Like they have like the good bones, and then they're like, let's put Venom in it, and
Yeah,
or let's bring the Sinister Six in the next movie, and it's like, no, I mean, it could be sure eventually, but you got to build to that.
yeah,
Which is like why like counter like to the opposite extreme, Marvel's Spider-Man movies work because they're like, we're not going to retell the origin story. We're just going to move forward and we're going to let this evolve and go from there. And I
Yeah,
feel like
exactly.
that's why they took a page from Guillermo del Toro and we're like, we don't need to, you know, tell the same story for a third time in a row or a fourth time in a row. Um, and yeah, it makes for the much better film. Well, before we wrap up, anything else you want to share about Hellboy?
Oh yeah, there's so much. There's so much great stuff with Hellboy. Like it's such a big connected universe. Go out and read Hellboy. If you love Hellboy, read the BPRD stuff. It's interesting because there's almost a definitive ending of the Hellboy comic, but then there's a second extra ending with the BPRD, excuse me, the BPRD series. And Mignola is still cranking out Hellboy universe stories. Like the most recent one was Giant Robot Hellboy, which is like a
Oh,
great Duncan Fragrato illustrated kaiju robot Hellboy versus kaiju, and it's fantastic. So just if you like Seed of Destruction, um, just keep with it. You're gonna love what comes next.
awesome. And if people wanted to find your art, where can they look online?
Oh, I am on Instagram, Absence of Sky Studios. Don't have a whole lot up right at the moment, other than some spatterings of sketches here and there. But that's going to change over the next few months. I've got a few things I'm working on that I'm hoping to put out in the world. Um, yeah, so just check me out and stay tuned. Hopefully, fingers crossed.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for joining me, Nick. It's been awesome. We'll have to have you back to talk about other comics and more about the Magnolaverse. I mean, I'd love to get more in deep with it. You've been listening to Detecting the Marvelous, a Far From Here and ShowbizMonkeys.com co-production. Your producers are Dan Rosen, Matt Ardill, and Shahara Ghaznavi. Music by Glenn Bouchamp and art by Ben Steamroller. Thanks for listening, and remember, true believers, Excelsior!